So this is our second day on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and today we're going to be talking about the transcendental aesthetic, which, if you remember, is about space and time, which are the forms of sensibility. They're the transcendental conditions that our mind places on sensibility. So remember, Kant is asking the big question: how are synthetic a priori propositions possible? Remember, synthetic means tells you something about the world. A priori means before you look. So we're wondering, how can we know about the world before we look? Remember our uh, room, our building. How can we know about what's inside that building before we look inside? And we saw that Kant's answer was to have a transcendental condition, a filter on our possible experience, that our mind must be actually constructing or controlling our experiences. So there must be a bouncer out in front of the building. And if he's only letting, say, women in, then we can know before we look that there will only be women inside of the building. So, in the same way, it's going to turn out that space and time are the source of synthetic a priori propositions because they're a filter on possible experience. They're a transcendental condition, which means a filter that will only allow certain types of experiences into our minds. And therefore, we can know before we look that everything will be in accordance with space and time. And we're going to see that they're the source of the synthetic a priori propositions of mathematics. We'll get to the transcendental logic later, which is the source of our synthetic a priori propositions of science. But today we're talking about mathematics, geometry, and arithmetic. So, mathematics is going to arise from the type of filter that is on our sensibility, that faculty of our cognition that gets experiences from the physical world. And we're going to see that there are going to be two different types of transcendental conditions or filters on sensibility. Some will involve space, they'll be the source of geometry, and some will involve time. Those will be the source of arithmetic, of counting, like in time, 1, 2, 3, 4, counting the seconds go by. There'll be the forms in which the filter of our sensibility will allow things into our experience. Geometry and arithmetic will arise from the transcendental conditions that we impose on sensibility and what can get into our mind in this through the senses. So remember, aesthetic meant senses, having to do with sense experience. Transcendental meant the necessary conditions or the filters, the transcendental conditions. So we're talking about these two sections today of the transcendental aesthetic, which just means we're looking at the filters, the necessary filters that our mind places on our sensibility. So we're going to have to talk a little bit more about what the sensibility is and how it functions. There's a couple other pieces of terminology that will be useful for us to get clear about. Phenomena and noumena. These are both the plurals of phenomenon or and noumenon. Phenomenon would be one thing. Phenomena would be the plural of phenomenon. And noumenon would be one, and noumena would be the plural. The phenomena is just an experience, any object as experience. It's the world that we experience is a world of phenomena or the phenomenal world. That word has sort of filtered into our common language through Kant. So if you Google on YouTube or look on YouTube, you'll find songs called We're Spirits in the Phenomenal World, which means that we live in a world of experiences. We live in a world of objects that our mind constructs as experiences. Um, you shouldn't confuse this with Berkeley's subjective idealism, because phenomena are experiences. The chair that you're sitting on the computer that you're watching, are phenomena. They're experiences. They're things that you're seeing. But they're real and objective because they obey universal laws of science and mathematics. And if I came in and looked at your room, I would see the chair and I would see them as well. Remember, the Copernican revolution was to redefine objectivity as shared objective structures, which we impose upon experience. So phenomena are real objects. They're real in that they obey the universal laws of experience, and we'd all see them the same way. But they are experiences. They are things in our mind that we have constructed. Um, Noumena is the term used for things outside of our experience. We'll see that we can't say the tree in the forest when no one's around to hear it, because it turns out the trees and forests are all phenomena. They're things that exist only after we've constructed them through space and time and our categories. But noumena would be whatever reality is outside of us. Kant used the German phrase Dingen an sich, or things in themselves, or things by themselves, as the term. He uses the word noumena to respond to. Phenomena was a Greek term that just meant things that happen, things that we see. Noumena is a made-up term by Kant. It wasn't a word before. It would be what corresponds to nous, which is the Greek term for mind. So noumena are objects of the mind that we can think of. The only reason that Kant used that term in that way is because if we could imagine a God seeing things, not as we experience them, but knowing them through his mind, sort of from the God's eye point of view, through purely intellectual experience and not through the senses, that's how reality might look to God. So noumena are sort of the God's eye point of view on things. But it's probably more useful. That's just a little bit of history of why he chose that weird term, noumena. But it's probably more useful just to think of them as reality apart from experience. And Kant's whole critique of pure reason is going to be to try to prove that things in themselves are unknowable, and that what we experience are not noumena at all. The chairs and tables and the real objects of science and mathematics are phenomena and not noumena. So let's bore into some more of the details of how experience happens. Since for Kant, remember the Copernican revolution is that it's in the process of experience or cognition, the process of knowing, that we create objects and impose the objective structures that science and mathematics depend upon. So there are three faculties involved in our everyday experience: the sensibility, the imagination, and the understanding. And they each have different types of representations associated with them. Sensibility produces intuitions, and we'll see that intuitions is a technical term for Kant. Sometimes we use the word intuition in different ways to mean things that we kind of feel rather than think through. But for Kant, intuitions just mean sense data. You may want to use the words sense data instead of intuitions if you get confused there. Sensibility provides the raw materials of our experience. We can think of our experience as a sort of a work of construction. The imagination is the actual worker who's actually going to create experiences. Imagination is the faculty of constructing images. Of course, some of our images are imaginary. They don't follow those universal rules. We just make them up however we want in free play of the imagination. But most of our images that we see are experiences. They're real images. They're things that we say are really existing in the world. Those are phenomena. So the worker constructs experiences when they're constructed in accordance with those universal objective shared laws. Then they're real experiences or phenomena. But the imagination is just the worker. It can construct all kinds of images. Most of the time, our imagination is bound. William Blake, influenced by Kant, called the way in which our imagination is normally bound by rules and conventions. He called them mind-forged manacles. that they were manacles, but not physical ones, ones that were forged by the very structure of our minds that could only perceive certain things in certain ways. These were the transcendental conditions. So it's those mind forged manacles that create the real world, the objective world that we all perceive the same. Um, and it's the foreman or the architect, which is the understanding, which is the faculty of concepts, that tells the imagination, that binds the imagination to put together the intuitions or the sense data it gets from the senses. It tells them to put them together in certain ways. Concepts are rules for the construction of experience. So an experience is made out of the raw material of intuitions, which is then guided by the rules of construction of concepts from the understanding. These two sources of our experience, the rules and the plans, the blueprints that come from the understanding, and the intuitions that come from sensibility, are the two types of transcendental conditions that the human mind imposes. This is our subject matter today, the sensibility. It's the transcendental aesthetic, the filters that sensibility imposes. Later, we'll get to the transcendental logic, which is the filters that concepts and understanding imposes on our experience. So let's talk a little bit more about the sensibility. The sensibility are the faculties by which we come into contact with the external world. Remember, the external world are noumena, are things in themselves. They're not yet trees and tables and chairs. They're not even yet in space and time, as we'll see. Those things only happen here in the world that we experience. Those are the only place we'll find tables and chairs in space and time. So we don't really know at all what noumena are, or whether there's many of them or few of them, or whether there's just one. It's useful to just think of noumena as like a giant bowl of mush, just a big lump of unstructured reality. And our senses are like a grid or a filter. And as reality presses up against this grid, it squeezes our perceptions of reality into separate intuitions. So the sensibility is the faculty by which we come into contact with things in themselves, or noumena, and it imposes a grid or a filter which cuts up our interaction with the physical world, with noumena, into separate intuitions, into a manifold or manyness of intuition. So you can think of our sensibility as being like a filter, a grid. When I was a kid, my mom would make cookies in a cookie cutter like this. You'd stick the unstructured dough into this tube, and then you'd put one of these discs at the end, and then you'd squeeze the dough through these holes. And those holes broke up the unstructured dough into discrete little bits of dough and added structure to them. Our sensibility um, imposes a filter or a structure that breaks up our experience with the world into a bunch of discrete intuitions or sense data, a manifold or manyness that comes from the way it breaks up this unstructured dough into discrete images. It might help to think about this in terms of how we now know that our eyeball works. We don't have chairs and tables or objects flowing into our mind through the senses. We get light signals that are bouncing off of object, and those photons, little bits of light, hit the many rods and cones, which are like a filter. They're laid out like pixels in a grid, and the information that's sent to our optic nerve isn't chairs and tables flowing up into our brain. Instead, it's just little bits of information. All it is how much is this little rod or cone? How much is this little pixel activated? And how much is this little pixel activated? Almost like digital data, like ones and zeros. This may remind you of what the scientific revolution did to matter. Remember, instead of having natures, it broke them up into little qualitatively identical particles, little bits of data, little ones and zeros. Kant, in his theory of how the sensibility worked, is sort of scientizing the mind, showing how our perception of objects don't come all at once, but come from little bits of data, little ones and zeros. And it's then up to our mind to then organize those ones and zeros on the basis of concepts. But now we're just talking about the filter that our sensibility provides and the structure that's sort of implicit in that filter. So we're going to see that space and time are two different things for Kant. They're, first of all, a transcendental condition, which means that they're a filter that keeps certain things out and introduces limits to what can get into our experience. So that we know that everything that gets into our experience will be structured like this grid. The romantic idea of the sublime, which Kant would later develop in his third critique, were things that were so big in experience that they would sort of break through the grid. Like if you stuck a rock through your cookie cutter, it might break open the filter and allow reality to flow in unfiltered. But normally, our experience is filtered. So the first thing that space and time are transcendental conditions. They're bouncers on our experience. So nothing can get into our sensibility unless it can fit past that grid. There may be other things in reality, but if it can't fit through the grid, it's not going to get into our senses. So in the same way, now we know that there's lots of types of radiation that can't get into our mind, things that are too small to excite each rod and comb, things that are too big to fit into our minds. Those just won't get into our experiences. The second thing that Kant says that space and time are themselves a priori intuitions. And this might be a little bit confusing because remember, an intuition is what a type of experience, a type of representation that we get through sensibility. But a priori means before experience. So you might think that this was an oxymoron, an experience before experience. Um, but what Kant means by it is that there is a grid in our experience, the structure of the grid, the structure of the filter itself imposes a grid or an experience that we can see even apart from the objects. If you think of a television screen, it has already a structure of pixels in it. Anything that doesn't fit into those structure of pixels, it can't be broken down into pixels and can't be represented in those terms, won't be able to be pictured on a TV screen. And before the TV screen is even turned on, before any broadcast or image is presented on it, you can turn it on and see the grid of pixels. And in that sense, it's a burned in structure, a burned in grid that is already there before the first experience. So, in that sense, it is an a priori intuition. We never actually see that a priori intuition because we don't start becoming conscious until we have experience. But we can sort of see within our experience, just as when you're watching TV, you can make out the grid. So when we're having experiences, we can make out the structure of space and time, which are this grid which presents itself in experience, but doesn't come from experience, but was burned in to our sense organs before experience. This is like this structure here on Star Trek. They had a holodeck, and before you would put anything into that reality, into that phenomenal reality, it had this three-dimensional grid. That was the a priori intuition. It's a pre-burned in innate experience, not of objects, but of the grid or the framework, which all of our experiences have to fit into in order to get through sensibility. So sensibility is those two things. Forms of sensibility, which are necessary conditions on all empirical intuitions, which means that they're a bouncer or a filter, but they're also themselves a priori intuitions, the structure of that grid that breaks up our experience into discrete intuitions itself leaves remnants of that grid within our experience, and we can see that structure itself in all of our experience as if it were an a priori intuition, as if it were a grid burned into our experience, like the grid of pixels on a TV screen, even before you turn it on, even before it has the first image on it. So let's look at Kant's arguments in the transcendental aesthetic. They're broken up into arguments about space and arguments about time. And it's useful to see how they work because they're simple arguments and they work as transcendental arguments. A transcendental argument, remember the word transcendental has two meanings. It means, first of all, beyond experience. And second of all, it means a necessary condition for experience. Let me give you an example. If you were in a house with no doors and windows, and it had a doorbell, uh, if you heard the doorbell ringing, even though you couldn't see outside of the door, you might think that you might be able to infer the existence of something outside of your experience, something that transcended your experience, on the basis of what you do experience. What you do experience is the doorbell ringing inside the room. So if you can say that the only necessary way, the necessary condition for the doorbell ringing is that there's someone at the door, if you can be sure that a squirrel hasn't chewed the wire, or it's not really somebody's phone going off, or it's not really a doorbell on the TV going off, that it really is a doorbell that has no other explanation than what's going on outside, then you can infer the existence of something outside of you on the basis of what you can experience. So this is sort of a weird thing about Kant's philosophy, and this falls under the heading of reason, pure reason, which is the faculty that is self-referential and is able to look at itself and be self-conscious and analyze the limits of the understanding and of experience and of sensibility. So even though we said that Kant believes that we can't have any knowledge of things in themselves, we can't have knowledge of noumena, it's going to turn out that there's some things we can know about the world outside of our experience. We can know about the filters. If the only way we can have certain types of experience is if there's a filter in place, then we can sort of transcendentally infer, use a transcendental argument to infer that there must be a filter of a certain place. So if we could know before we even looked that there were only women inside the bar, then even though we may not look outside the bar, we might assume that there must be a bouncer out there that we can't see. So these arguments are the first transcendental arguments in the Critique of Pure Reason that we'll look at. The famous transcendental deductions, the two versions of them in the first and the second edition that we'll get to next week, are the most important portions of the Critique of Pure Reason. So Kant is going to sort of, his Copernican revolution involves sort of reversing the normal way of thinking about these basic problems of modern philosophy. Descartes started inside of his mind and asked, how can I be sure that I know anything? Instead, Kant is going to take as his starting point the fact that we do know things. He's going to say, let's imagine that we do have synthetic a priori knowledge in geometry and arithmetic. What filter would have to be in place? Imagine that you saw that you could know before you even looked that only women were going to be in the room. Then you could ask what bouncer must be in place in order to make that possible. So he's going to start from the assumption or start from the fact that we do indeed have synthetic a priori knowledge in geometry, and then ask what filter must be in place. So the first argument is that space can't be an empirical concept. It can't come from our experience because any experience of objects, before we can experience the objects, there has to be a space or a grid in which they're ordered. And space, the second argument is that space is an a priori intuition because we can't represent to ourselves the absence of space. So you can try to imagine nothing. Even if you imagine nothing, that nothingness would still have that grid. It would still have the empty structure of space and the empty structure of time. So he then tries to answer some of the arguments of Leibniz. Remember, who thought that space and time were relative. They were just the relationships between monads. So he says space is not a concept of the relations of things. He thinks that there's only one space. That whole grid already exists all at once. And the parts of the grid, the pixels, can't precede the whole because they have to exist within it. Unless there were already the whole grid, one pixel wouldn't be to the right or the left of any of the other ones. He contains the fourth argument that we've already looked at, the transcendental argument that the synthetic a priori propositions of geometry are only possible if space is an a priori intuition. He includes that in the A edition. And then the last argument is that space is an infinite given magnitude. You can't get a concept of infinity from merely set of relationships between objects. So space can always be conceived of as infinite wherever you are in space. If you were to imagine a limit to space, you could imagine reaching your arm outside of that limit and finding more space. So since it must already contain an infinite number of places in the grid, it can't be a relationship between our already existing representations because there can't be an infinite number of representations. So space can't come from experience because you can't have experience unless they're ordered in space. And space is an a priori intuition because we can imagine that space. We can see the a priori grid even when we imagine it without objects, without anything in it. And we can see that there are similar sets of arguments for time. Whereas space is the source of a priori propositions of geometry, we can know in advance that everything that we experience will follow the rules of geometry because we know that before it gets into our mind, it must already pass through this grid and must be represented on this a priori grid, which has a geometrical structure which it imposes on our reality. In the same way, time is the form of our inner sense. Even if we're not experiencing external objects, we experience ourself passing through time. And the form of our self-consciousness, of our awareness of self, takes the place of this passage of time. There's that same grid of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of accumulated moments. That is the source of the a priori propositions of arithmetic. So we get exactly the parallel arguments that time can't be an empirical concept because all experience of objects involves already having a time in which they can be ordered. That time is an a priori intuition. If we try to eliminate all of the events that are happening, we can still see or still experience the grid of time, the past, present, and future, even in the absence of all objects. And in the same way, it can't come from relations because there's just one time and you couldn't have the parts before there was a whole to have in relationship. And time is an infinite given magnitude. So there's no way that we could get it from relationships of particular objects. And we get the original argument as well that the synthetic a priori propositions of arithmetic would be impossible unless time was a filter or a bouncer on our experience. We'll see later that time has a special status because it's the form of our own self-consciousness. So in later philosophers like Martin Heidegger or Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialist philosophers, they'll think that the passage of time and our experience of time tells us something essential about the human condition and the nature of human consciousness. And we'll see how that comes from Kant, since his transcendental deduction, which we'll look at later, will deal with the way in which we construct ourselves and come to have knowledge of ourselves in time. So let's summarize. Space and time are both two things. They're transcendental conditions or forms of sensibility. They're filters that structure anything that gets into our senses. And they're also a priori intuitions, which means that they're an already existing infinite grid within our experience that is already there before our first experience, and which anything that we experience must somehow be put into. So that means that space and time are empirically real. Empirically real means that they are real parts of our experience. We know automatically that they have to be in our experience. Anything, if you have a dream or if you have a hallucination, and you can't fit it into our objective, universally shared time sequence, you can't figure out when it happened. If you can't fit it into space, then you would conclude that it didn't exist. They're filters on real experience. That's how we distinguish craziness from sanity. Sanity is in accordance with the universally shared structures or filters of experience. Um, so that's what it means to say that space and time are empirically real. They're real for all experience, and everyone who's sane will experience the same space and time because they're necessary structures or transcendental conditions. But they're transcendentally ideal. Space and time come into existence through the grid, the manifold of the filter of sensibility that breaks the thing in itself up into discrete representations or intuitions or sense data. As strange as it may seem, there is no space and time outside of our experience. We can't even say that there are 2 or 3 or 4 things outside of our experience. Mathematics only comes into existence through the forms of sensibility. So this is our first example of Kant's critique of pure reason. We don't know anything about things in themselves outside of our experience. We don't even know whether there's 1 or 2 or 3. We don't even know what shape they are or whether they're in space. They don't have primary properties. They don't have mathematical properties. For the first time, Kant is saying math and science come into existence only through our cognition, only through our sensibility. It turns out they're empirically real because they're universal and necessary structures that act as a filter on experience. So we all see them the same way, but they're not true of experience outside of us. You can watch this little video that gives you a short little summary of Kant's transcendental aesthetic. And if you think that this is crazy, to think that space and time have no existence outside of us, it might be useful to see how Kant's ideas on space and time have influenced our contemporary physics. Um, Einstein is often thought to have shown that Kant was wrong about the structure of our experience, because Einstein showed that our geometry of space in his general theory of relativity showed that our geometry of space is not Euclidean. It doesn't follow the rules of our experience. Um, but Einstein's special theory of relativity, in some way, showed that almost all contemporary physics believes, like Kant did, that how we perceive reality is somehow dependent upon our experience of it or dependent upon our method of verification. In his introduction to special relativity, Einstein tried to explain what meaning time and space could have apart from measurement. In order to measure a spatial distance, you would have to have a ruler or a rigid rod that would be the measuring unit that you would use to measure the distance between something. But how would you know that your measuring stick stayed the same? If I took a rubber band and measured things, I wouldn't get accurate measurements. But the only way you can measure something is if you have some arbitrary rule or some arbitrary standard to use and assume that that measuring stick is keeping the same shape and maintaining the same size. For Einstein, that was the speed of light. And as a result of that, he saw that how we would think about space and time would change depending upon the observer. Um, Einstein saw that very fast moving people would have time slow down for them. that people who are moving fast would perceive objects as shrinking or contracting. So built into our fundamental physics is the idea that space and time only have meaning through our measurement of them or through some interaction with them, that they have no meaning independent of our experience of them.
Speaking of David Hume's radical empiricism and the problem of induction, Immanuel Kant wrote, "I freely admit that the remembrance of David Hume was the very thing that many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave a completely different direction to my researches in the field of speculative philosophy." In this lecture, we will explore Kant's critique of pure reason, in which he directly responds to David Hume's arguments regarding knowledge. It will be helpful in studying Kant's philosophy to first define a few terms. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge obtained through experience. A priori knowledge, on the other hand, is knowledge gained independent of experience. Analytic propositions are statements in which the predicate is contained within the concept of the subject. For example, all bachelors are unmarried males is an analytic statement because the concept of bachelor contains the concept of unmarried males. Synthetic propositions are statements in which the predicate concept is not contained in its subject concept, but is related to it. For example, all swans are white is a synthetic proposition because the concept of swan does not contain the concept of white. According to Hume, there are only analytic a priori and synthetic a posteriori judgments. If Hume is correct, then the problem of induction is very real. As we discussed in the video series on Hume, the problem of induction compels us to conclude that we cannot obtain certain knowledge, but rather only probable knowledge. Kant, however, believed that there are synthetic a priori truths. Specifically, he believed that all mathematical propositions were examples of this type of knowledge. Kant asks the reader to consider the expression 7 plus 5 equals 12. There is nothing in the concept of 7 or plus or 5 that comprises the concept of 12. Therefore, it is not an analytic truth, but rather a synthetic truth. Furthermore, we do not solve this mathematical expression by appealing to experience. We solve it through pure reason, which makes it an a priori truth. So, Kant concludes that synthetic a priori truths do exist, contrary to Hume's claim. Having proven the existence of synthetic a priori truths, Kant next turns to the question, is it possible to know things in themselves? In order for something to be an object of knowledge, we must experience it. But according to Kant, we can never directly experience anything. He argues that our perception of reality is the result of a combined interaction between objects and the internal structures of our minds. Just as a person who is wearing rosy-colored glasses sees everything as possessing a rosy-colored hue, so too does our mind filter external objects through the forms of time, space, and causality. This leads him to conclude that it is impossible to have knowledge of things in themselves, and thus he believes that he has conferred an inestimable benefit on morality and religion by showing that all the objections urged against them may be silenced forever by the Socratic method, that is to say, by proving the ignorance of the objector.